So some background information into the study. It was conducted in the USA in 2007, and at that time there was a big problem in the country with domestic violence, which is seen through statistics provided by the US Department of Justice. Those statistics included 700,000 violent crimes being committed per year by intimate partners, and around half of all female victims of those offences lived with kids under the age of 12 who were actually seeing those offences most likely on most occasions. And around half of all men who abuse women tend to also abuse their children or children who live with them. Abuse and witnessing abuse has been seen to generate issues in children. Those issues and difficulties are things like behavioural, emotional and social problems. And those problems include things such as depression, anxiety, academic difficulty, low self-esteem, and most of all, importantly for this study, is aggression. So those problems show a trend of violence in adulthood, both between non-family members as well as family members. So a key theory in this study is the theory of intergenerational transmission of violence, and that research into that has shown a link between exposure to violence and violent adult offences. And that's brought upon by a theory which has been studied by Albert Bandura in 1973, which is called the social learning theory, which suggests that children who observe modeled behaviour learn how to replicate that behaviour if positive reinforcement has been given to it. So if positive reinforcement's been given to violent offences which children have observed, they will most likely replicate that behaviour in future. So that also causes children to inherit ineffective communication and conflict resolution techniques, and it's been shown that violence in particular is learnt through modelling, through two aspects of modelling, both general and specific. General modelling is when aggression, in this case, is accepted in families, only accepted, nothing in particular, whereas specific modelling is particular forms of aggression are accepted in the family context, and those specific types of aggression have been actually observed by the children themselves. So past studies into this area have shown that the most violent offenders were those who have been physically abused or witnessed domestic violence when they were children, as opposed to offenders who haven't been abused or haven't witnessed abuse as children. So domestic offenders do not actually show signs of severe mental disorders usually, but they do actually show signs of some personality disorders, such as antisocial behaviour and narcissistic tendencies. And there's actually been no current research on the difference between witnesses of domestic violence and those who were abused in relation to perpetrating this behaviour as adults. And that's something that this study has actually looked into to fill that gap in research. So the aim of the study was to actually investigate the relationship between children observing violent model behaviour, which is the independent variable, and characteristics of family violent offenders, which is the dependent variable. And it was hypothesized that male offenders who experience domestic violence, either by enduring it personally or having observed it, are more likely to imitate that violent behavior in adulthood than those who did not. So the sampling method in this study was not actually specified, but it was seen that all of the sample was male offenders, and they've all been court-ordered between 1998 and 2002. There was 1,099 of these participants, and they were all various races. So as you can see, 85% of those participants were African American, 14% were Caucasian, and 1% wasn't actually specified. But this isn't actually balanced in terms of relating to the national average of cultural diversity. But the age range was actually an accurate representation of the population that was selected from that specific area. So the age range was between 18 and 65 with a mean age of 32, and the study was cross-sectional. So there's measures that have been in place to collect this data, and they assess three areas. They assess, firstly, the generality of violence and non-violent criminal behaviour, secondly, the frequency and severity of domestic violence, and thirdly, the psychopathy of the offender. So to assess the generality of violence and non-violent criminal behaviour, they looked at things such as police reports and something called the Abuse Scale Score of Child Abuse Potential Inventory. To assess frequency and severity, they actually conducted a questionnaire, which is used in various domestic violence centres around America. And the frequency is the sum of the scores that were collected in that questionnaire combined. And to assess the psychopathy of the offender, they used a scale called the Millen Personality Scale, which included 5 aspects. And the procedure, pretty much, there was 3 steps to this procedure. They firstly underwent an assessment battery to assess the information about the offender and the victims that they had obviously perpetrated. And then following up, that was actually done in a group setting. So most of the participants were doing that at the same time. And then that was followed up by an individual interview, which lasted about 45 minutes and was conducted by either advanced graduate students or master's or doctoral level professionals in the area of study. And then after that, they were assigned to one of 4 groups, either neither witnessed or abused, witnessed only, abused only, or both. So the results showed that there was no relationship between childhood trauma status and specific demographic of the participants, and that included things like age, gender, well, obviously not gender because they were all males, but age, and ethnicity. So those were pretty much ignored for the rest of the study. But it was shown that there was a significant difference in non-intimate violence between groups. So violence increased with exposure to violence as children, and differences between groups in non-violent criminal offences were shown in the graph below. So as you can see, those that observed both, well, those that have been both abused and witnessed abuse, perpetrated more non-violent criminal offences, but people that had neither witnessed or been abused perpetrated more than those who had just witnessed themselves. Results also showed significant differences in frequency scores between groups. So those who had not been exposed to domestic violence committed less intimate partner violence than those who had, which is no surprise to the researchers. And again, in severity, that was pretty much the same trend. So those who had not been exposed committed less severe intimate partner violence than those who had, as is seen in the graph below again. So additionally to that, there was a significant difference in psychopathy, which increased as the amount of exposure to violence increased. And there was no significant difference found after investigating the narcissistic scale, which was hypothesized that there probably would be, which was a surprise to the researchers. So results also showed that those who were exposed to more violence tended to be more depressed than those who hadn't. So the experimenters concluded that as exposure to violence increased, the chance that an individual would commit violence towards someone rather than an intimate partner would increase also. Those who experienced domestic violence as children are more likely to engage in domestic violence as adults than those who did not experience it. Those who were abused as children are more likely to abuse their own children as opposed to offenders who were not abused themselves. And finally, those who were abused as children were more likely to engage in domestic violence than those who witnessed abuse but were not abused themselves. So some limitations to this study is that no group which does not undertake domestic violence after experiencing childhood violence is included. So there was no comparison group, no group that hadn't perpetrated these offences after having been abused as children. Secondly, all participants in the study were caught by the police. So there might be a completely different sort of aspect for those who hadn't been caught by the police. It's not really not really an accurate representation of the population. And that's a broader population. Obviously, the population for this was offenders that you can't really classify them as offenders if they haven't been caught, but you never know. There could be a lot more different circumstances that come into play. Again, the independent variable was only measured by self-report, which is a really subjective measure. There could be things such as biases or lies that have come into that. So they're a bit harder to assess in terms of generalizing those results. So it could be better not to have that come into play. And again, those self-reports or those questionnaires were actually, so the questions in there were quite subjective. Again, the circumstances of these situations, they're not accounted for. So you can't actually be fully sure that the violence that was perpetrated was a result of that childhood exposure. It could be completely different circumstances. And the sample's not a true representation of the population because all of the samples were from one specific area. That area could potentially be a really problematic area and could not really reflect the true nature of all of the offenders as a whole, because this is obviously assessing offenders in the United States. That's a pretty large population group, and to have all of the offenders from one area is quite problematic for the study. So for future research, a longitudinal study should probably be undertaken, which pretty much eliminates the subjectivity of the self-report and obviously monitors the circumstances of the abuse. So you can eliminate two of those limitations in one go by doing a longitudinal studying instead of a cross-sectional study. And obviously sampling from various locations around the population group would create a more generalizable result, because obviously those participants the sample would be a true representation of the population. Creating a comparison group would give a true representation of how offenders have been impacted by how exposure impacts the behavior, because you can see the other side of the equation, those who haven't actually offended. And by using less subjective measures to gather data, like making sure those questions eliminate any aspect of subjectivity, would create much more solid results that can be generalized to the wider population.